Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Authenticity and the Apocalypse, Ragnarok in Skyrim versus God of War. So I've bundled the two of them together because, well, they make for a useful comparison, and I think it's easier to do that than separating them out. We'll see how it goes. So, starting with Skyrim. Skyrim, of course, is littered with references to Scandinavian culture, both visually and narratively, as well as in the area of world building. But one of the most significant is, of course, from the game's central mythic arc, the conflict with Alduin. So as the Dragonborn, you move towards fulfilling your role in this apocalyptic event, which is foretold in a prophecy that is depicted in a relief carving in Skyhaven Temple. You locate that carving in a quest called Alduin's Wall, along with members of the Blades, a group of Imperial agents and dragon hunters. And let me just say, I have always, in all of my playthroughs of Skyrim, just left the Blades to their own devices after Alduin dies, because I'll be damned if I'm killing Parthenax. I'm sorry. I had to say it. Anyways, Alduin's Wall, the physical object, is not like the word walls, where you find the different pieces of dragon shouts. It's considerably more elaborate. It illustrates an existing prophecy, the prophecy of the Dragonborn, which I believe was originally contained in an Elder Scroll. And the full prophecy actually refers to several major events in Elder Scrolls series history. But there is a section that relates specifically to the Skyrim context. The latter part of the prophecy talks of a time when, quote, misrule takes its place at the 8 corners of the world, and the Snow Tower, presumably the province of Skyrim, lies sundered, kingless, and bleeding. And when the Dragonborn arrives in Skyrim, it is being torn apart by a civil war between the Empire and the rebel faction, the Stormcloaks. This is after the murder of the High King. And communities and even families are divided by their loyalties to one side or another. So, for example, when the Dragonborn reaches Whiterun, they discover that a long-time friendship between the city's 2 chief clans, the Battleborn and the Greymanes, has deteriorated almost to the point of blood feud, both over their differing views on the Civil War and the Greymanes' belief that the Battleborn are responsible for the disappearance of one of their sons in battle. So the prophecy of the Dragonborn paints an image of a world lost to chaos and disorder, which is very reminiscent of a similar stanza from the Voluspa, which, as you remember, is our main source for Ragnarok. This sort of social chaos is a clear reflection of the broken, chaotic world that will foreshadow the doom of the gods. And I'm just going to give you that relevant stanza again. Brother will fight brothers to the death. Sister sons will corrupt their kinship. In a harsh world, whoredom is widespread. Axe age, sword age, shields are shattered. Wind age, wolf age, till the world collapses. No man will show mercy to another. So, there's a reason that those images linger in our minds. It's a very powerful picture of a world in chaos, of a world turned upside down, where all the usual bonds of love and loyalty are severed. All right. So, of course, there are other parallels to Ragnarok within the Alduin questline. Alduin can be understood as representing both Jormungandr, the world serpent who kills the god Thor, as well as Nidhogg, the serpent who gnaws on the roots of the world tree and eats the souls of the slain. This is something that Alduin himself does when he breaks into Sylvangard. And of course, as we already know, the final battle is held in Sylvangard with the aid of the heroes of the past, just as Valhalla is defended at Ragnarok by the Einherjar. Now, it's somewhat more successful, obviously, than the Einherjar are at Ragnarok, but that's part of the issue here. There is a lot that ties the Nordic apocalypse to the Norse, but there is one way in which the battle with Alduin is absolutely nothing like Ragnarok. Namely, the destruction of the world can actually be averted. In contrast, the Norse Ragnarok is inevitable. I mean, rebirth and renewal will follow destruction, but the world that exists will burn. The gods will fall in their prophesied battles with their opposite numbers. And maybe we shouldn't be surprised that the parallels break down at the end of the story. I mean, Skyrim is a game. It would be poor game design to set up a central quest line where the hero is going to fail in their central quest, inevitably, where there's nothing that you can do. A game like Skyrim is only successful if you have the illusion of meaningful choice. And it is always an illusion because a game is restricted by its programming. And there's many different ways to define meaningful, obviously. But can you imagine the frustration if there was just no way to beat Alduin? Would Skyrim have done as well? What do you think? I'd be interested to hear if anybody has any thoughts on that at the Zoom session. I mean, had Skyrim been published 5 years later, maybe we would have seen a variant ending, where the Dragonborn fails and the world is destroyed. This could be like the bad ending that so many RPGs get these days, the ones with branching narratives. But instead, you get this clear path to victory. And maybe this illustrates that there's only so far that a game can go, really, when borrowing directly from the medieval Scandinavian worldview. Just because it is not our worldview, and we don't consider failing to prevent the apocalypse fun, which is fair, really. Now, God of War, completely different kettle of fish. And in a really interesting way, it uses its writing to avoid the problems that Skyrim ran into with being so beloved by white supremacists and that sort of thing, by creating a very anti-heroic sort of story. And really, if I had to define it in more technical terms, they figured out a way to avoid the pitfalls that come along with a romantic take on Northern medievalism. They leave behind the fantasy North, as Truitt called it. This is an accomplishment because the romantic view of the medieval North is the dominant view. It is so deeply embedded into our culture from the Victorian period onwards. And if anything, it's been actually strengthened by trends within historiography itself. You know, there's still... we looked at some of the counter-revisionist takes that emphasize the violence of the Vikings as well. Now, what I find interesting is that God of War, in leaning away from romantic medievalism, sort of gets away from the genuine strangeness. In leaning away from romantic medievalism, gets back to something closer to the genuine strangeness of the medieval Scandinavian worldview. This is a world where the gods are terrifying, where Ragnarok can't be stopped. You know, they can still use all kinds of medievalist and fantastical elements, but it doesn't valorize anyone, not even our heroes, really. You know, Kratos and Atreus are just trying to survive. And, you know, Atreus is a plucky little guy. I quite like him. Kratos, you can like Kratos without admiring Kratos, if that makes sense, especially if you know his background. Now, there's an idea that I wanted to introduce to you, which is awfully relevant for a lot of medievalist stuff, even though it was originally designed specifically to talk about Arthurian material, and is Norris Lacey's concept of the tyranny of tradition. So what he means by this is that there are some stories, some medievalist stories, that are just so well known. So King Arthur, so well known, that whenever anybody's going to retell them, they have to tell a story that at least corresponds in major ways to the audience understanding of, you know, orthodox Arthurian fact. They can't deviate too far from the traditional way of the story because everybody expects King Arthur to look a specific way. They're like, where's Lancelot? Where's the love triangle? When they brought out that Clive Owen King Arthur where it was set in late Roman times, that was what a lot of the reviews said. It's like, oh, it's not romantic. It's dirty. Everybody's filthy. There's no sense of romance and adventure. That's the tyranny of tradition. And I would argue that in a lot of cases, there is a tyranny of tradition within depictions of Norse mythology as well. And the tradition there that's being tyrannical is something much more recent. It's the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Its depictions of Thor, Loki, Odin, and the rest of Asgard has had a massive impact on 21st century society's perspective of what a fantastical version of the Norse gods should look like. I mean, when this image of Thor from God of War Ragnarok came out, I remember seeing a tweet where one guy was very indignant about it. He said, no, 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 Thor should look like this. And he basically, this was awful. It was like an artistic image of a version of blonde Thor in like bikini armor with, it looked like 2 6-packs. Like he was just ridiculously ripped and so forth. And, I remember looking at that thinking, yeah, tyranny of tradition, woohoo. Definitely we got that going on there. The other thing to keep in mind is that, when you push back against the tyranny of tradition, when you try to creatively reimagine something like Norse myth, it's reflecting the way in which it was created originally. Think about Snorri taking oral and other sources and creating his Eddas out of them. You are doing something like that if you're someone like Corey Barlog, who is retelling Norse myth in a completely different way. One of the major scholars of Norse myth, Carolyn Larrington, says that because, the Vikings went so many places and their cultures, developed so many regional differences that there is no single version of the myth, that we should be welcoming diversity in how the myths are portrayed in modern popular culture. So, it's a unique way of exploring the cultural worldview of the original creators to try and take a step back and see it through different eyes, I would argue. And really, like what they accomplished with God of War, and one of the reasons I'm so keen on seeing Ragnarok when it comes out, is to create something that, to me, who knows a lot about Norse myth, feels very authentic, yet also feels fresh. So, here's the original picture of Thor from the secret ending of God of War. Ragnarok is obviously key to the narrative of God of War in a much more literal and straightforward way than in Skyrim. So you have, unbalanced murderous Balder as the antagonist. Obviously makes the likelihood of his death very high. As you remember, he meets his end not in the climactic fight with Atreus and Kratos, but almost incidentally afterwards when he tries to kill Freya. The significance of Baldur's death is not foreshadowed earlier in the game, which was an interesting choice. Kratos seems to think there's more to it, obviously. He wants to understand why he's being hunted, what's going on here. And Mimir. Mimir is an interesting character. I am pretty positive that Mimir knew a lot more about what was happening than he really let on through much of the game. He makes a couple of cryptic comments thinking that, it's their destination that Odin's interested in, that the fact they want to go to Jotunheim is why he sends his best tracker after them. He makes constant comments about Odin's paranoia about the giants and their prophesied role in Ragnarok. After all, Mimir also figures out pretty much spot on that right away that Kratos is a god, and also very quickly that he's the ghost of Sparta as soon as he gets enough information to put that together. So is he able to also figure out that Atreus is half giant? Now, spoiler alert, obviously, for those of you who have not played to the end of God of War, I did warn you that I would be talking about all the events of all of these games. When Kratos and Atreus reach Jotunheim and find it apparently abandoned, the touch of Atreus' hand on a seemingly blank wall reveals a sort of relief carving that depicts not only the events of their journey, but the secret that Atreus' mother kept even from Kratos, that she was a giant. So Faye is actually Lofi the Just. And Lofi is Loki's mother or father or parent of some sort. I think it's technically father. The gender of giants is a little iffy sometimes, and the gender of anybody related to Loki is even considerably more so. The runic inscriptions also reveal something that Kratos knew but had never told Atreus, that his mother had actually wanted to call him Loki, but let Kratos name him Atreus because it was so important to him. So the implications of the mosaic immediately upend any previous assumptions that Kratos and Atreus had made about why they were being pursued. Kratos realizes that Baldur wasn't after them, he was after Faye. And Faye brought all of this about by arranging things so that, first of all, Kratos would break her protective magic by using the marked trees to build her pyre, and that by heading off to Jotunheim, they would be chased. And Atreus, as a result, winds up playing the same role as his mythological counterpart, just in a much more innocent way. It's the mistletoe strap that Kratos creates for him out of one of the mistletoe arrows. After Atreus breaks the strap on his quiver, that is what breaks the magic on Baldur. And when Kratos and Atreus come back from Jotunheim, they discover that the dwarves who'd been helping them out all the way along, Brock and Sindri, had known perfectly well that Faye was a giant. And in fact, she was what they call the last guardian of the Jotnar. And they, in fact, created the frost axe for her as a way of redressing the imbalance of power they created by making Mjolnir for Thor, who went on to use it to massacre so many of the giants. They also tell Kratos and Atreus that Fimbulwinter has started 100 years earlier than expected. And as they go home, Mimir fills in the last bit about how Laufey was a legend for her ability to protect her people against the Aesir. It's Laufey's the mother, sorry. It's Farbodi who's the father. I get this confused sometimes. Laufey may have been a goddess in myth, maybe not. It's really very difficult to tell. Certainly we never see Faye on screen. We never even see an image of Faye, except on that wall in God of War. But she kills multiple birds with one stone by setting up this journey. She not only creates a situation where her husband and her son are going to have to learn how to get along with each other, which they hadn't really up until that point, but also sets in motion the destruction of the people who murdered her people. This is the beginning of the end for the Aesir. I mean, Ragnarok is not just the end of the world in God of War, it is the punishment of the Aesir for their genocide of the giants. And realizing this makes the repeated emphasis from characters like Mimir throughout the game of how badly the giants were treated by the Aesir, how wrong what Odin and Thor did, look like the foreshadowing that it actually is. And we'll have to wait and see how it works its way out in the sequel. I can't wait. I will be pre-ordering and downloading as soon as it's available. That is, it pretty much goes without saying. Okay, that will do it for this lecture. I will be back shortly with Assassin's Creed Valhalla.